Hello students, I am Nitika Chillar. I'll be taking the paper History of English Literature with you. Now before we begin, it is important to realize what is English literature. English literature is the body of written works produced in the English language by inhabitants of the British Isles, including Ireland, from 7th century onwards to the present day. Now when we talk about history of English literature, we go back to around 5th century AD and we go up till the present times. Now the first period that we talk about is called the Old English period. Now this period begins from 500 AD and continues till about 1100 AD. That is the first period. Second period begins from 1100 AD and continues till about 1500 AD. This is called the Middle English period. After that, from 1500 AD to 1660 AD, we have the English Renaissance, that is the third period. From 1660 to 1785, we have the Neoclassical period, the fourth period, and the fifth period begins from 1785 and continues till as long as 1837, which is called the Romantic period. And from 1837 to 1901, we have the Victorian age. From 1901 onwards, we have the modern period. Now, going back to the very first period that began in 500 AD and continued till about 1100 AD, which is called the Old English period. That period essentially was characterized by a lot of foreign invasions and the internal struggles. England as such was invaded by a lot of people in that particular period. There was a lot of internal strife, a lot of struggle in that particular period, which resulted in a mixing of several races, tongues and cultures. The language of this period is called the Old English period, hence the name, the language of this period is the Old English and hence the name Old English period. The first written record that we have comes from this particular period, first written record in English language. It dates back to around 690 AD, and the literature that comes from this period, literature in English language that comes from this period, it consists of all kinds of poetry, prose, charms, riddles, maxims, proverbs, and it's a mixture of pagan traditions, thoughts about life, universe, nature, a lot of Christian thought and moral values. So we know that the theme and the content of the poems and prose that came out in this particular period has its source not only in Bible but also in the pagan traditions, and there is no clear-cut delineation between religious and non-religious poetry, nor is there a clear-cut distinguishing factor between prose and poetry that came out from this particular period. Now, when we talk about literature, essentially literature is divided into three: the poetry, the prose and drama. We'll be dividing each period that we do from each period into these three sections. So let's talk about the poetry that came out in this particular period. We have the Old English poetry essentially included long epic heroic poems, and they drew on Bible as well as pagan sources for their content. The poetry is based on historical events. They talk about invasions, occupations. The writings are more or less like chronicles. There are annals, and the poetry also serves as historical records. Now, some are in the form of poetry and describe various battles. The themes normally are war, conquest and bravery. The poetry also tends to lament, and there is a general tone of melancholy to the poetry. It talks about man's struggle against the environment, life's difficulties, the passage of time. It talks about how fleeting life is, how delicate the balance of life is. It talks about the compassion, God's compassion, mercy. Some of the very famous poems that we have from this particular period are called the Wanderer, the Seafarer, the Ruin. Then there are also, we have some other poems which talk about separation and compassion. They talk about sadness, and two of the most famous poems that we get from this period that are about separation and sadness, they are called the Wife's Lament and the Husband's Message. Now, one of the most famous poems that we have from this particular period is called Beowulf. Now, if you're aware, Beowulf is also a movie. It's been turned into a the poem has been turned into a movie. It's also been televised. Now, this Beowulf came from this particular period. The authorship of the text is unknown. We do not know who is the author, but earlier on it was said that the poem was written somewhere around the 8th century, but later the historians concluded that the authorship of the poem has to be somewhere around the 9th to the 10th century. Now, Beowulf is a 3000 verses long poem, and like I said, the manuscript that we have, it has been concluded that it dates back to 10th century. It is the only epic that we have from this particular poem, and even though that the authorship is unknown, we get to know that while the author we do not know the name of the author, but we can kind of conclude that the author was well read. He had knowledge of the Bible and the other texts, especially Homer's Odyssey, because we see elements of Homer's Odyssey in this particular poem. The work tends to glorify a hero and values qualities such as bravery, generosity, modesty, humility. The setting of the poem is in Scandinavia, and it's been written in it's been set in around 500 to 600 AD. The first part of the story takes place in Denmark, and where we see that the court in the Denmark, the king of Denmark, who goes by the name of Hrothgar, has been terrorized. His court has been terrorized by a monster called Grendel, and the king of Denmark, the king that presides over the court of Denmark, Hrothgar, he calls in Beowulf, who's known to be a very brave general, to help him kill the monster Grendel. Thank you.